In the winter of 1953, a widow in Salford could feed herself for an entire week on less than 3 shillings, and every meal came from one pot. If your nan kept a lid simmering on the back burner every Sunday morning, the kitchen warm, the hallway filling with the smell of onion and bay, then you already know this world. What you may not know is that one of the cuts on this list was sold by the butcher for a penny each, and modern supplement companies now charge £30 a month to replicate the same nutritional value in a capsule. The people who taught us to forget these meals profited from the forgetting. Here are 25 one-pot meals that seniors living alone have almost entirely lost, and should never have. Number 25. Liverpool scouse. Mutton neck chops, or scrag end if the butcher had nothing better, dropped into a cast-iron pot with potato, carrot and onion, then left on the lowest possible gas ring for the whole morning. No watching required. By noon, the meat had given up the bone entirely. The broth had turned deep amber, and the pot had thickened to something richer than soup and softer than stew. A neck of mutton at a Liverpool market in 1952 cost 8p and produced 4 full portions without any further expense. On the Docklands and in the back streets off Scotland Road, this was not a special dinner. It was a Tuesday. The dish bound itself so tightly to the city that Liverpudlians eventually took its name as their own identity. Gastropub menus across Manchester and London now list something broadly similar: lamb, root vegetables, a slow braise, for between £15 and £20 a bowl, which they describe as rustic. Rustic was a word that came later. Your nan called it dinner, and she made it from the cut the butcher charged least for, because she understood that flavour is not bought but extracted, and that the cheapest cut in the window, given enough time, produces the deepest pot. Number 24. Monday, bubble and squeak, cold boiled cabbage and mashed potato, whatever remained from Sunday, mashed roughly together and pressed flat into the pan in the dripping left from the roast. The heat turned up, and nothing touched until the underside caught and charred slightly at the edges. The sound it made as the crust formed was the sound of Monday morning, a low, persistent sizzle that meant there was something on for breakfast before the walk to work. A survey of working-class household habits conducted for the National Food Survey in 1952 noted that cold-cooked vegetables were present in approximately 72% of British homes on Monday mornings, and almost always put to use this way. What that figure cannot capture is the chemistry. The burnt layer underneath is not a mistake. It is the correct result, and it cannot be produced with fresh vegetables. Only starches that have been cooked once, cooled overnight, and reheated will release the sugars that caramelize that precisely. Fresh cabbage in the same pan produces a pale mush. Monday's leftover cabbage produces a crust. The difference between Sunday's dinner and Monday's bubble and squeak was a single night in the larder, and it cost nothing extra. Number 23. Lancashire Hotpot. Best end of neck or middle chops, lamb, always lamb, layered in a deep earthenware pot with sliced onion and carrot, then sealed with a tight crown of overlapping potato slices across the top, a little dripping brushed across them, and the lid placed on. In the mill towns of Blackburn, Burnley and Bolton, this pot was assembled before 6 in the morning and left at the baker's on the way to the looms. The baker's residual oven heat did the work all day. By the time the shift ended at 5:30 and the pot was collected on the way home, the lamb had given itself entirely to the broth, the potato crown had turned gold, and the kitchen smelled of it before the front door was open. Mill workers developed this method specifically because they could not leave a fire burning unattended for 12 hours. The slow oven demanded no attention on the day. The skill was in the knowing what the pot needed, and then having the discipline to leave it entirely alone. Modern cookery schools now teach low and slow braising as an advanced technique requiring precision equipment and careful monitoring. Your nan achieved the same result by telling the baker what time she'd be back. Number 22. Scotch broth, pearl barley, a neck of lamb, swede, leek, dried split peas, and cold water into the pot together, brought slowly to a simmer, left to murmur for 2 full hours without intervention. What came out was not thin or polite. It was dense and golden, the barley swollen to fill the broth, the lamb in soft shreds, the split peas dissolved entirely into a base that carried everything else. In 1940, the Ministry of Food issued Scotch broth in its official food facts pamphlets as the model wartime meal, specifically because it met the full daily nutritional requirement for a working adult from the cheapest possible cuts and the most basic store-cupboard grain. A bowl of it settled in the chest for hours, not the brief heat of something eaten quickly, but a warmth that sustained through the afternoon. Ready-made tinned Scotch broth now costs 60p and reconstitutes in 2 minutes. Taste it alongside the original, and the comparison tells you immediately which of the two is a memory of the other. This was not a shortcut version of something better. This was the real thing, and the tin is what happens when a nation forgets how to make it. If any of that takes you straight back, hit subscribe. The meals still to come cost even less. and one of them the butcher practically gave away. Number 21, corned beef hash. A tin of corned beef, 4p in 1954, broken up directly into the frying pan with diced potato and sliced onion, pressed flat with the back of a spoon and left entirely alone over a medium heat until the underside formed a dark, near black crust across the bottom of the pan. The color was the signal. Deep mahogany meant the salt had caramelized into the fat and you had something worth eating. Too pale, and it was simply stew in a pan without purpose. By 1955, the National Food Survey recorded corned beef as present in more than 80% of British working-class homes. It required no refrigeration, kept indefinitely in the larder, and its protein content matched a fresh beef mince that cost 3 times the price. One tin fed one person for 2 days. At today's prices, the same portion of corned beef costs approximately 90p. That dish, one tin, one pan, 8 minutes, costs under £1 and outperforms a £12 ready meal in every nutritional measure worth applying. The hash crust is not a technique, it is patience. The patience to press the thing flat and not touch it until the pan tells you it is ready. Number 20, pea and ham soup. Split yellow peas, soaked overnight in cold water, then drained and added to the pot with a ham hock or a handful of cheap bacon scraps from the butcher on a late Saturday afternoon. Enough cold water to cover, brought slowly to a simmer, the lid left slightly ajar, and left to cook for 3 full hours until the peas dissolved entirely and the liquid reduced to something close to porridge in its density. Thick, dark gold, intensely savory. The smell of it reached the backyard while it cooked and had not left the house by evening. A widow living alone in Leeds in 1958 could cook this on a Sunday morning and eat from the same pot until Thursday, reheating 1 bowl at a time on the gas ring without any refrigeration needed. 1 hock cost 3p. French restaurants now serve a version of this dish as potage Saint-Germain at £14 a bowl, garnished with cream and described as classical cuisine. This is that soup, without the cream, without the £14, and with the honest acknowledgement that working-class British kitchens had been making it under a different name, in a different pot, for a very long time before any restaurant put it on a menu. Number 19, pan hearty. Raw potato and onions sliced as thinly as a sharp knife would allow, transparent at the edges, almost paper, layered in a heavy pan with a scraping of hard cheese between each layer and a plate placed directly on top to press everything down. The heat set to the lowest the ring would hold and left there, untouched, for 40 minutes. The sound the pan produced was the faint tick and settle of the potato releasing its moisture, and then, closer to the end, a quiet hiss as the underside met the dry heat of the base and began to color. This was a Northumberland dish, documented in Women's Institute handbooks from the branches around Hexham and Morpeth from the 1930s onward, and almost entirely unknown south of the Tees. What it produced was not a fry-up, it was a true gratin, soft through every layer, golden and firm underneath, the cheese absorbed into the starch rather than sitting on the surface. Modern cookery schools now teach this preparation under the names Tian and Gratin Dauphinois and build weekend courses around it. The name changed, the method did not. What it required was the confidence to leave the pan alone and the knowledge of what to listen for. Number 18, steak and kidney pudding, beef skirt and ox kidney, the cheapest meat in the window, cut into rough pieces and packed into a suet pastry lining inside a pudding basin. A suet pastry lid crimped firmly over the top, a double layer of greaseproof paper tied with string, and the whole basin lowered into a pot of simmering water on the hob. 3 hours of unattended steaming was all that was required. The warmth that accumulated in the kitchen during those hours was particular to that method, not the dry heat of the oven and not the sharp smell of the pan, but something closer to a fog. Slow, enveloping, the steam folding into the curtains and the wall. That steam did what no oven could achieve with those cuts. It dissolved the collagen in the beef skirt without tightening the fibers, turned ox kidney from something sharp into something mild and yielding, and produced a suet crust at the edges that was almost liquid where it met the meat. The basin was its own pot and its own plate. Supermarket versions of steak and kidney exist in every freezer aisle. They carry the same name and share nothing else. The original needed only a pot, a length of string, and the knowledge that 3 hours of patience is not a long time if you have something else to do. Notice what connects those first 8 meals. Not the ingredients, not the cuts of meat, but the principle underneath. None of them required attention once they were on the heat. The skill was not in the constant doing, it was in the knowing. What temperature, what vessel, what timing, and then the discipline to walk away and let the pot do what the cook had already set it up to do. That is what this list is really about. The next section goes further, and the ingredients get cheaper. Number 17, herrings in oatmeal. Fresh herrings, 2 for 2p from the Friday fishmonger, gutted and scored 3 times across the back, pressed firmly into fine oatmeal on both sides until the coating clung to the wet flesh. Into a dry pan over a high heat, skin side down first. No oil added and none needed. The herring carries enough of its own fat to fry itself from start to finish. 4 minutes one side, 3 the other, until the oatmeal turned a deep gold at the edges and the skin beneath it had crisped into something that crackled when the knife touched it. This was a Scottish and Northern English staple documented in household accounts from Dundee and Aberdeen from as early as the 1880s. A single fresh herring at tuppence contained more omega-3 fatty acids, more vitamin D, and more complete protein per penny than any other fresh food available at a British fishmonger's counter in the 1950s. Tinned salmon, which most shoppers considered the superior purchase, delivered roughly 60% of the same nutritional value at 4 times the cost. This was not the budget choice made from necessity. This was the best possible choice, and the people making it understood that, even if the price suggested otherwise. Number 16. Oxtail stew. Oxtail joints, jointed by the butcher for a few pence, and sometimes passed across the counter outright as a favor to a regular customer. Browned dry in the pot until the exterior of each piece darkened and the fat rendered into the base. Then onion, carrot, and celery, enough cold water to cover, and 4 to 5 hours on the lowest possible heat. What came from that pot announced itself before anything else was apparent. A dark, almost wine-like richness in the smell, saturating the hallway and carrying to the street. The broth reduced to a sticky, dark gravy that coated the back of a spoon and held there. Oxtail was priced as a throwaway cut throughout the post-war period because most customers did not understand what they were walking past. Those who did understood that the tail holds the highest concentration of gelatin in any part of the animal, producing a depth and richness of texture that a fillet or a chop at any price cannot reach. French bistros in London now serve braised oxtail for £22 a portion and describe it as a forgotten classic. It was not forgotten in Barnsley. It simply stopped being affordable once restaurants discovered what certain cuts were actually worth. Number 15. Baked rice pudding. A level tablespoon of pudding rice into a shallow oven dish, a pint of whole milk poured over, a teaspoon of sugar, a scraping of nutmeg across the surface, placed in the oven alongside whatever was already cooking, the hot pot, the joint, whatever occupied the main shelf, so the second dish cost nothing beyond the fuel already being spent. 2 hours later, the rice had swollen to fill the dish, the milk thickened to a barely moving cream, and the surface carried a deep gold skin. A bag of pudding rice in 1955 cost 4p and made 12 puddings. The warmth of it arrived at the table in the dish itself, which held heat through the entire meal and made the second portion eaten cold the following afternoon almost as good as the first. Ready-made rice pudding now comes in single-serve refrigerated tins at 65p, eaten cold from a spoon, requiring nothing of the kitchen it passes through. The homemade version is not a superior form of the same product. It is a different food entirely. One is a convenience item, the other is something that stayed in the dish after the eating was done. Number 14. Culinary. The Sunday roast chicken, stripped down to the frame, every piece of flesh removed, placed into a deep pot with cold water and brought slowly to a simmer. Leeks cut in thick rounds added after the first hour, along with a handful of prunes in the Scots tradition, and whatever pearl barley remained in the jar. The resulting broth was not cloudy or heavy. It was clear and golden, the fat skimmed carefully from the surface, pale enough to hold up to the light and show color through it. In 1941, the Women's Institute circulated cocker-leekie in their wartime kitchen pamphlets as the correct method for a stripped carcass, noting that the broth produced contained more available protein than a fresh chicken breast purchased separately that same morning. A Sunday roast for 2 became a Monday supper for 1, the same bird still giving on its second day of work. This was not using up what remained after the real meal was finished. This was the second meal the bird was always intended to produce, and the Women's Institute had the documented evidence to say so. Your Nan made it the morning after the roast without weighing a single thing, because she already knew what the carcass still had left to give. Number 13. Kippers in a jug. A whole kipper, 6p from the fishmonger, 4p for the smaller ones, stood upright in a tall stoneware jug. A full kettle of just boiled water poured over it until the fish was submerged. A saucer pressed firmly over the top to hold the steam in, left to stand for exactly 5 minutes. The brief hiss as the boiling water entered the cold jug, the short bloom of steam, and then silence. That was the entirety of the cooking process. No pan to scrub, no fat spitting across the hob, no smell settling into the kitchen ceiling for the rest of the morning. 5 minutes later, you lifted the saucer, moved the fish to the plate, and poured the tea. The National Federation of Women's Institutes documented this method in its home management handbooks as the cleanest and most reliable technique for cooking smoked fish indoors, producing a moist, perfectly cooked result every time without exception. That method is not remembered now. It deserves to be, because it costs nothing to learn, leaves almost nothing to wash, and works without variation regardless of who is doing it or what equipment they have. Number 12. Faggots in onion gravy. Pig's liver, heart, and lights, the offal the butcher could barely give away on a Friday afternoon, minced together in a bowl with breadcrumbs, fresh sage, mace, and salt, then shaped by hand into firm, dark rounds, each one wrapped in a sheet of caul fat, the lacy membrane from around the pig's stomach, bought separately for almost nothing, then arranged in a deep tin, half submerged in a thick onion gravy made from the pan drippings, and a little stock, baked for 45 minutes until the caul fat rendered down and basted the faggots from the outside as they cooked. The smell of baking faggots in the 1950s was specific to the Midlands and South Wales on a Friday evening, a neighborhood smell, not a domestic one. Ready-made versions now appear in supermarket freezer sections, labeled as retro comfort food and priced at a modest premium. The original was not comfort food in any marketing sense. It was precision use of the whole animal, the parts that cost almost nothing, bound together with 10 minutes of mixing, producing something that kept 4 days in the larder and fed a family of 4 for the price of a bar of Sunlight soap. Number 11. Homemade baked beans with bacon. Dried haricot beans soaked overnight in cold water, then drained and added to the pot with a strip of fatty, streaky bacon, a level tablespoon of black treacle, a teaspoon of dry mustard, a splash of malt vinegar, salt, and enough water to cover generously. Brought to a slow simmer, covered and left for 3 hours, the lid removed for the final 30 minutes to let the sauce reduce and thicken. What came out of that pot was warm in the particular way that a meal cooked slowly for 3 hours is warm, not just in temperature but throughout, as if the heat had been folded into every individual bean. A bag of dried haricot beans in 1955 cost twopence and soaked to produce 4 generous portions. Heinz began selling canned baked beans in Britain in 1901, and by the 1950s had persuaded most households that making them from dried beans was too slow and too complicated. It is neither. The assembly takes 3 minutes, everything else is the pot doing its own work. The homemade version costs a fraction of the tin and tastes entirely different. What the tin contains is not baked beans. It is an approximation made for the convenience of people who were encouraged to forget what the real thing was. Number 10. Potted meat, pig's trotters, or a piece of cheap beef shin. The cut with more collagen than any other available at the counter, covered in cold water and simmered slowly for 3 to 4 hours until the meat released completely from the bone. The pieces lifted and left to cool just enough to handle, then the meat picked off by hand while still warm, shredded fine between the fingers, texture judged entirely by feel as it came apart in the hands, packed tightly into small glazed dishes, the reduced cooking liquor poured over while still liquid, then left overnight in the larder. By morning it had set firm, cold, dense, savory, with the slight give of good set gelatin under the knife. This was not making do with what the rest of the household had rejected. This was the charcuterie shelf of the working-class kitchen, and every element of skill sat in the hands, knowing which fibers to keep, how tightly to pack the dish, how long to reduce the liquor before pouring. Modern charcuterie shops in every city sell a small pot of rillettes for 8 to 10 pounds. In Salford in 1955, this was called potted meat. It cost almost nothing to produce, and the technique lived in the hands of anyone who had watched their mother do it once. Number 9. Tripe and onions. Dressed tripe, already bleached, cleaned, and pre-prepared by the butcher, sold ready to cook, cut into wide flat strips and placed into a pot with sliced white onion and enough whole milk to cover. Brought very slowly to a bare simmer, never a boil, and left to cook gently for 45 minutes until the milk reduced to a pale, velvety sauce and the tripe softened to a texture closer to thick pasta than to anything most people today would associate with the word. The color was entirely white and cream, the tripe pale, the onion transparent, the sauce the ivory of good butter. Tripe cost 6pence a pound in Sheffield in 1950 and 5pence in Bradford, the cheapest protein at the butcher's counter in almost every northern English town. District nurses across the Yorkshire riding specifically recommended it for elderly and convalescing patients throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, because it is the most easily digested complete protein available, placing minimal demand on the stomach while delivering full nutritional value. Tripe shops operated on every high street in the north until the 1970s. They did not close because the food had stopped working. A generation was persuaded to feel embarrassed by it. That generation was wrong. 7 of the last 9 meals required no skill in the moment of cooking. They needed the right preparation, the correct vessel, and then restraint. No adjusting, no lifting the lid, no adding things partway through. The discipline of leaving something alone is harder than it sounds and produces better results than interference. This is not a simpler form of cooking, it is the advanced form. The meals coming next are smaller and quicker, and the most counterintuitive one is very close. Number 8. Baked stuffed marrow, a garden marrow grown from seed on the allotment, arriving in late summer faster than any family could consume it, split lengthways, the seeds scooped clean with a spoon, the hollow halves placed in a roasting tin. Into each half, minced beef, browned briefly with onion, a handful of uncooked rice, salt and pepper, a splash of water to prevent it catching, packed into the cavity until it sat slightly proud of the rim. A sheet of greaseproof paper pressed over the tin, and into a moderate oven for 50 minutes. The smell of beef and onion baking inside the marrow was specific to August and September, the weeks when allotments across the Midlands, Yorkshire and South Wales produced more marrows than any larder could absorb, and gardeners gave them away at the gate. A garden marrow grown from a packet of seed cost almost nothing. The same vegetable now appears in farm shops at between £2 and £3 each, labelled as heritage produce and sold to customers who would not know what to do with one. The marrow did not change. When the knowledge of how to cook it disappeared, a free vegetable quietly acquired a price. Number 7. Deviled kidneys on toast. 2 lamb kidneys, a penny each at the butcher's counter, sometimes less on a Saturday close to shutting, halved, and the central core of fat and vessels cut away with a small sharp knife, the pan heated until it shimmered, a scrape of butter placed in, the kidneys set flat side down, and left entirely alone for 90 seconds. Then the turn, and the immediate sound of the second surface hitting the hot metal, a hard, sharp sizzle that dropped quickly to a lower note as the meat sealed. A full teaspoon of dry mustard and a splash of Worcestershire sauce stirred into the juices collecting around the kidneys. 30 more seconds, then onto toast, 4 minutes from cold. Here is what the butcher sold for a penny each, and what most post-war shoppers walked past without pausing. The kidney is the most nutrient-dense organ in any mammal. A single lamb kidney contains more vitamin B12, more folate, and more bioavailable iron than 3 full portions of fresh spinach. Supplement companies now market iron, B12, and folate in separate capsule combinations costing £30 a month or more to maintain. Your nan bought the equivalent for a penny, cooked it in 4 minutes, and put it on toast. That is not old-fashioned. That is arithmetic. Number 6. Kedgeree. Smoked haddock, the undyed kind, pale cream and firm. The cheapest smoked fish at the fishmonger's slab, placed in a pan of cold water, brought just to the point of a shiver, and left to poach gently for 8 minutes. Lifted out, the skin removed, the flesh broken into large flakes, directly into a pan of yesterday's cold-cooked rice, a hard-boiled egg quartered alongside it, a full teaspoon of curry powder, a knob of butter, and the pan set over the lowest heat. Stirred gently until everything was just warm through. The warmth of kedgeree was its own particular quality. The rice absorbed heat slowly and held it, and the combination of smoked fish and spice produced something that smelled entirely unlike its parts. By 1940, kedgeree had completed its journey from Anglo-Indian officer's table to working-class British staple. The smoked fish was the cheapest cut at the counter, the rice was already cooked, and the whole meal was ready in 15 minutes from ingredients that had cost almost nothing the day before. Meal kit companies now deliver a kedgeree box with pre-measured spices for between £7 and £9. The original was built from yesterday's rice, a piece of inexpensive fish, and an egg. Number 5. Jam roly-poly. Plain flour and shredded suet worked together with the fingertips, a pinch of salt, enough cold water added gradually until the dough came together soft and pliable. Rolled flat on a floured board, spread with whatever remained at the bottom of the jam jar, not carefully or evenly, simply pressed across the surface and rolled up from one end into a firm cylinder. Wrapped tightly in a floured cloth, tied at each end with string, then lowered into a pot of simmering water and left for 2 hours. The smell of suet pastry steaming with warm fruit was specific to Sunday afternoon, slower and deeper than the sharp sweetness of biscuits baking, something that settled through the kitchen and did not leave quickly. Flour, suet, and a near-empty jar of jam. The total cost in 1955 was under threepence. People recall eating this pudding 50 years later with a precision they cannot apply to meals that cost 20 times as much. The specific weight of the slice, the color of the jam worked into the spiral, the custard poured alongside. Memory does not record expense. It records warmth, and this was warm. The final 4 meals on this list are the most fundamental. The cheapest ingredients, the fewest steps, and in every case the most direct evidence that what your nan had was not just resourcefulness, but understanding. A knowledge of food so precise that it produced exactly what the body needed from almost nothing. Frugality without knowledge is deprivation. Frugality with knowledge is a system. These last 4 are the system at its most refined. Number 4. Mince collops with tatties. Plain minced beef. the cheapest mince in the window, sometimes with a proportion of fat that a leaner cut would never carry, placed into a pan with a grated onion and just enough water or stock to prevent it catching. No browning first, no flour, no additional seasoning beyond salt and pepper. Simmered until every drop of liquid had cooked away and the mince sat thick, dense, and intensely dark in the pan, not gray but properly colored, the fat absorbed back into the meat, the onion invisible but present in every mouthful, served alongside plainly boiled potatoes. For generations, this was considered the dullest meal in the British repertoire. Minimum effort, most unassuming plate, least prestige. A study by the Department of Human Nutrition at the University of Aberdeen found that lean minced beef and boiled potato together provide a near-complete nutritional profile for an older adult living alone. All essential amino acids, adequate carbohydrate, iron, zinc, and potassium, more efficiently than almost any supermarket-ready meal at any price point. The meal that nobody respected turned out to be the one doing the most work. Number 3, bread and dripping broth. A spoonful of solid dripping from the glazed crock on the windowsill, not the pale upper layer used for frying and pastry, but the concentrated dark jelly at the very bottom, where the meat juices had settled and intensified through the week, dissolved into a mug of freshly boiled water with a pinch of salt and a grind of pepper. A slice of bread torn roughly into the mug, left to soften for a moment. Before refrigeration, dripping was managed in layers in a stoneware crock, the pale top for cooking, the dark base for drinking, each layer renewed as the Sunday roasting tin produced its next deposit. The warmth of that mug was not incidental, it was the point. A hot mug that required no cooking and cost nothing, taken between proper meals when the larder was low and the next shopping day still ahead. Modern food writing now treats beef dripping on toast as a rediscovered luxury item and prices it accordingly at brunch menus. The practice of dissolving it into boiling water and drinking it as a meal is not mentioned anywhere because it has no modern equivalent and makes no sense to anyone who has not stood at a cold windowsill with a crock and a kettle and understood exactly why it was done. Number 2. Baked egg custard. A whole egg beaten lightly in a bowl, a cup of whole milk warmed on the hob until just above hand temperature. Not simmering, simply warm enough that the egg and milk would combine without the protein seizing, a level teaspoon of sugar and a scraping of nutmeg across the surface. Poured into a small oven-proof dish, set inside a tin of warm water to buffer the heat, and baked in a slow oven for 25 minutes. The test was touch, a single finger pressed gently to the center. If it held firm but gave very slightly, it was ready. If it wobbled freely, it needed 5 more minutes. If it resisted entirely, the heat had already taken it past the point of return. District nurses visiting elderly patients across Yorkshire and Lancashire throughout the 1950s recommended baked egg custard specifically as the ideal food for those who had lost their appetite. High in protein, gentle on the digestion, soft enough to eat without effort, warm enough to feel like care rather than medicine. A chilled, ready-made custard requires nothing of the person eating it. The baked version required someone to think about you carefully enough to judge the temperature by touch. That is a different kind of nourishment entirely. Number 1, potato soup. 1 potato, 1 onion, a scrape of dripping, a pint of cold water, salt. The onion went into the fat first and you heard the pan settle from a sharp sizzle to a low murmur as the moisture cooked out. Then the potato, chopped rough, no need for uniformity, and the water and the lid and 20 minutes on the heat, mashed roughly in the pot with the back of a spoon, not blended, not strained, eaten with bread. For a woman living alone in a rented room in Ancoats in 1957, this was Tuesday's meal, and Wednesday's, and the one she returned to when everything else had run low. But the potato is not second-best food. It is one of the most complete ingredients in nature. Starch for energy, vitamin C in amounts that sustained this country through 2 world wars, potassium for the heart, fiber for the gut. 1 potato, 1 onion, a pint of water, and a scrape of dripping. 1 gas ring. That kitchen was working to a nutritional standard that took modern science decades to articulate in the language it requires to be taken seriously. She was not eating what she could afford. She was eating exactly what her body needed. That is not poverty, that is knowledge, and it is almost entirely gone. Try one of these this week. Scotch broth, potato soup, or baked egg custard. Nothing exotic, nothing expensive, and nothing you need a printed recipe for. Tell us in the comments which of these you remember, and tell us who taught you. Their knowledge deserves to be named.